So yeah, good afternoon. Thanks for the opportunity to be here and share some of the research that we've done before. So this is the structure of my presentation today. I'm going to touch a little bit on this thing that we call coastal environmental settings. Also going to give an overview of distribution of global or the global distribution of mangroves. Talk a little bit about global the ecology of deltaic mangroves or mangroves in deltaic. I think it's easier just to look here than try to read from the back. I might need some glasses or something like that. But anyway, yeah, then we're going to talk a little bit about mangrove ecology and how that's related to deltaic geomorphology. Then I'll get to the center of my presentation, or the main focus, which is the geographic sampling bias, and some ways to try to mitigate some of that sampling bias, and finally like a summary at the end. I like to bring us back to LSU, like some 50 years ago or so, when Bruce Thom, who was here in this department, and that's when a lot of the discussions about how coastal geomorphology affects, how ecology tracks like coastal geomorphology. And I love this like sentence from Bruce Thom's book chapter. And basically he said, like, if you just look at what's being published for mangroves, it all looks like a chaotic mass of special cases represented by unique combinations of climatic, geomorphic, and biologic conditions, right? So it's just a mess, just like you plot that data and it looks like a bird poop, right? That falls and spread it everywhere. And you can't tease out like what it looks like. But it is possible to identify regional environmental settings defined largely by geomorphological conditions, which are repeated at different scale on all continents. So he's talking about fractal, right? The fractal nature of coastlines. And these settings influence the course of mangrove establishment and growth. So the way that I've been trained, it's that you have this surface, like thin sheet, right? And then that's the geomorphology. And then you have plants growing on top of it, mangroves and marshes, and they track what's happening with those landforms as those landforms evolve and change over time. So what are those coastal environmental settings, right? We saw that triangle earlier today on Bob's talk. And we're going to be talking about deltas, which are on this end of the ternary diagram right here, which is the river-dominated type of coastal environmental setting. Those would be those two right here. So the river-dominated up here, and this composite river wave dominated, which you see that quite a bit here in the Mississippi, Terminus Lagoon in Mexico, coupled with the river, and so many other places around the world that you can see the river bringing down the sediments over here, and then your longshore currents and wave just distribute and form those lagoons associated to this feature, to the river that's now emptying or discharging over here. Notice that some cases, like this was an old distributary or river mouth that shifted and now it's no longer feeding that lagoon, right? The other, just for comparison, there's a classic estuaries or tide dominated, your sandbar lagoons, fjords, and also carbonate, like we have Florida and the Caribbean islands, for example, or the Holocene terrace rifts across many of the oceanic islands. But again, the focus is on the deltas. So how that relates to where mangroves are around the world, right? So a couple of years ago, more like a handful of years ago, actually, we put this paper out there that I think, correct me if I'm wrong, Mark, David, you guys know that stuff. But I think that was the first time that we put a number to how much of the world's mangroves were in deltaic plains relative to estuaries, relative to coastal lagoons and carbonate, and even archaic coastlines, right? One interesting thing about this classification here is that you have like the really large river deltas, like the ones that pergrade and built a lot of land. But you also the authors here made a big deal about what they call the small deltas, which are the significant river systems that contribute quite a bit of water, of course, and sediment, but not necessarily form like a clear pergrading coastline. Sometimes we don't have like that much of a coastal platform for those sediments to build up, right? But they're still significant. Here we lump them together in one category and we call them deltas. And you have the numbers here on this axis relative to those different coastal environmental settings. Again, deltas are 1 and 2, and then you have your tide dominated or estuaries, then you have lagoons, carbonate, and archaic or dry arid coastlines. This is a paper led by John Day here at LSU, and quite a bit highlighted right here are the authors from LSU as well. this coastal wetlands in Anthropocene. It just got published, I think, early this year, December last year. And you have the location of the global deltas. The blue ones are the 15 largest global deltas. I think over 100 square kilometers of area, if I'm not mistaken. And the red ones are the remainder above a certain size. And the size of the dots are equivalent to the deltas area, just to give an example. And as you can see, flat out, like in the tropics, right, it's where you have your largest deltas because of the precipitation, runoff, and so on. Another thing that was really interesting to look at for this paper is here you have the latitude, north and south of the equator, and you have the delta area distributed along latitude. And guess what mangroves do? They just track that global distribution of deltaic area. So a lot of the global mangroves are actually on top of deltaic floodplains. It's about 40%. And why that's important for the ecology? Like I said, the ecology tracks the geomorphology, right? So you can see here, this is a red mangrove, Rhizophora mango in Costa Rica, Teraba sierpe delta system, and it's a 3-meter, 3.5 meter tidal range. You can see the mark of the tide right here, like black. This is Denise, a master's student that graduated here about a year ago. This is me. It took us like probably half an hour to get to from the bottom to that height in the tree. And here's the prop root, some like 8 meters, 9 meter above the soil. So deltas, large rivers, drain huge continental areas, bring a lot of nutrients down to the coast. Plants use that up to grow above ground, especially we're in the true tropics, right? And here you can see above ground. So those first two are deltas here, large deltas, small deltas, again, tide-dominated lagoons, carbonate, and dry coastlines around the world. And you can see the above ground biomass, the size of those trees, where you have deltas, are significantly higher relative to the other coast environmental settings, right? Deltas are always like highly productive. This is litter fall productivity. So the amount of leaves and debris that, you know, shed off the trees, you can see that's really hard where you have delta relative to the other types of coastlines. And here's root productivity. You can see the deltas are in the reverse order because those are different publications, but here's your reproductivity, mostly like fine reproductivity in deltaic environments relative to estuary, lagoon, open coast. It's much higher as well. So they're very productive environment, again, responding to that energy and nutrients that the rivers bring down. Here's another example for, so we have a lot of carbon stored in the biomass, right? Because of that partition of biomass between above and below ground. But deltas also bring a lot of sediment down and associated with them, as we heard today from several talks, a lot of like organic particles that come together with it. And a lot of burial occurs in those deltas right here. You can see the burial rates in grams of organic carbon per meter square per year relative to the other coast environmental settings, right? Same thing, well, if 40% of the world's mangroves are in deltaic floodplains, you multiply that number by the total area of mangroves growing on top of deltaic floodplains, and you do the same with the other coast environmental settings, the area the mangroves occupy in those coast environmental settings, you get a lot of like that annual burial happening in deltaic floodplains. So not only where you have a large river, a large delta, you have like the biggest mangroves on Earth. You also have like the hotspots for carbon burial, like Tracy just showed, especially the labile part, right? Wouldn't it be cool to go to all those places and show that it works the same everywhere? I got those samples if you want to look at it. But here's the part that I want to get to, transitioning to the gaps. Here's all your other coast environmental settings. Here on the Y, on the x-axis, you have the proportion of global mangrove area. And here you have the proportion of observations. This is for carbon burial, for what Tracy just showed us, right? So look, deltas are way underrepresented, right? Even though most of our mangroves are there, they're not that simple, right? Color schemes right here to tell you like which ones of those coast environmental settings are. But ideally, you wanted everything to be along that line or above, right? But that's not the case. And that's, again, carbon sequestration in soil. And here's a paper that we have in review right now where we looked at mangroves here on this first column, salt marshes, and also seagrasses. In the first row, it's greenhouse gas emissions. The second one is carbon sequestration in the soil and woody biomass. That's why we have triangles and, I think, squares we put in this figure. And here's DIC lateral exchange GICTA lateral exchange with net tidal exchange over tidal creeks or pour water exchange, right? And you see a lot of points, right? Especially for the mangroves here. And so like, all right, so I remember that the deltas are distributed mostly along the tropical zone here. So we got it covered, right? But now I'm going to break that down in a different way to plot that data. Remember, here you don't have only deltas in these figures. You have all the coastal environmental settings that I showed you before. So let me take a minute to explain this figure. Just focus on the blue or greenish part right here. If you get a global mangrove map and you break down into 1 kilometer by 1 kilometer tiles, and for each one of those 1 kilometer by 1 kilometer tiles, you extract a bioclimatic or a tidal amplitude or a river discharge value for that tile. That's what each one of those points are. So it covers the entire global mangrove map area, right? So you get all those values. So that tells you like what is the range of that environmental variable that you're looking at mangroves exist on. Does that make sense? Because if it doesn't, then nothing works after this. Okay. All right, so that's what we have here for a mangrove area. And it's going to repeat itself. Every time you see blue, it's what we get from this global GMW or global mangrove watch distribution area. Now in the bottom, it's actually the data that have been sampled by people, right? The data that we've been collecting, you've been collecting, and we've been compiling that information, putting on data sets, and then we plot it against here. So what you see, the first graph, it shows you annual average cycle amplitude, right? So how tall and low tides go. And you can see for the most of it, we have sampled in micro tidal, so less than 2 meters, right, of tidal variation. Some sampling in mesotidal between 2 and 4, very little actually for meso, and almost like nothing for macrotidal. There's quite a bit of mangrove tiles right here that occur in macrotidal area, so above 4 meters of tidal range, right? So we don't know much about surface elevation change. I missed that out. That's important. Those measurements are for RSETs or rod surface elevation tables. So you're monitoring net elevation change with this apparatus here, so you can tell if, you know, whether you have accretion or subsidence, shallow compaction, what's the actual net effect on your surface elevation. So we don't know much about net surface elevation change for, mangroves located in macrotidal systems. And here we use inorganic suspended particulate matter as a proxy for riverine discharge because the color of the water. So if you have a large river, you should be getting more chocolate-ish, right? More like brown water. And you can see that here's where our deltaic mangroves likely are, and we don't know a whole lot about it because that's how much we have sampled. So we don't really know about what's happening with our deltaic mangroves because we just don't have information coming from it for surface elevation change. That's important because that wraps up a bunch of like processes that we heard today. Surface deposition, subsurface accretion, such as root turnover, production versus decomposition, there's the soil expansion with temperature of the water, and so on. So that wraps all this up right here. So it's really important to know what's happening relative to this technique. And then we've also talked about carbon sequestration stocks and how amazing wetlands could be to act as a carbon sinks, right? Because they store, they keep a lot of that sediment and carbon bind for over century periods of times into millennia. But it's also important to know what's outgassing, what's coming out of the decomposition, right? So you can get the net balance or the true or close to true net carbon sink capacity for those wetlands. So here we're looking at equivariance measurements for CO2 and methane, and you can see the number of observations for mangroves around the world. Again, global distribution of mangrove area. For tidal amplitude, we have largely sample on microtidal areas. We don't know much or nearly nothing about mesotidal and macrotidal systems. Here's your river discharge again, using color of the water as a proxy for the size of the river or the discharge of the river. Again, lots of like, mangroves along large river systems that we have very little understanding on how those processes impact greenhouse gases production, emissions, and so on in those systems. Here's what I call episodic, because it's when you use like either a static chamber or some kind of flow through a headspace method. It's not a flux tower. It's whatever else you can do to measure gases, right? Same thing right here. This tidal amplitude. This is going to be your color of the water as a proxy for riverine discharge. And again, we always like lacking a lot of information relative to where the global mangrove area is located. Same thing for N2O. I repeated the slides just to give you an idea. And the point here is like, it's great that we're talking about stocks and fluxes that are bringing in carbon, but it's really important for us to know what's going out so we can do a net balance and get closer to estimating what the net sink capacity of those systems are. So ways forward, how can we mitigate some of that? There's this thing called Coastal Carbon Library and Atlas. It's hosted by the Smithsonian. It's a place that I work right now. And here's a paper that put out this, explanation on how this network works. There's like working groups. There's a soil working group. There's a methane working group. And what we do there is provide the means for people to have their data, curated, QA/QC'd, and put in a standardized platform that's free for use and allowed to produce synthesis. I don't want you to read any of this here, just to give an idea what the architecture of the network is about. And if you want to know more about this, how to become a member, contribute, then either talk to me or just Google this right here, and you get to the right people who will tell you how to become a contributor and join one or the working groups. Please do it, and then let's do cool research out of it. So here's like the structure of the database. You can see right here by parameter, bulk density, organic matter fraction, carbon fraction, your dated cores, and here's the number of samples or cores that we have cataloged in the database. Here's like how many cores. We have a full profile and partial profile, and how this is like showing you what they're suitable for. So there's a lot of cores that have been curated, QC'd, archived in a very standardized way that are ideal for stock assessment, ideal for calculating boil rates, or using for modeling approaches. So it's a really powerful resource. And it also gives you an idea of the bias, right, that we're talking about. So the red regions right here are very underrepresented. Look at Brazil right here. This is where I grew up. I'm originally from here, from this part right here, actually. And it's very sad to see that we're still in the reds because we have the second largest mangrove area in the world, right? Very little work done there. It's very frustrating. I still haven't got money, a grant to go down there and do research, but that's one of my pursuits for sure. Same thing here with Indonesia, largest mangrove area in the world. Still very little information that we have from there. And you can see here that graph that shows you the proportion of area relative to the number of observations. Analysis like that is only possible with a data set like I just showed you, the Coastal Carbon Library and Atlas. So please contribute. That's the other working group that I mentioned about, the methane working group. That paper just got published a couple of months ago by the members of that working group. So that kind of database allows you to do that, connect with a bunch of people and pull like some really neat global or regional synthesis where you can constrain quite a bit of the uncertainties, right? So here you have your pore water methane against carbon flux millimole per meter square per second. And you can get your thresholds right here, right? If you use the 50th or the 10th or 90th percentile, depending on how the data breaks down. Same thing against surface or pore water salinity. So again, that's only possible when you, not only possible, but one way to make it possible is when you contribute to databases like that. And another thing that I wanted to call attention to is those 2 or 3 actually papers that are represented here in this slide. And I was talking to earlier today. So this is a paper by Doug Edmonds, and actually his student, his former PhD student, Rebecca Caldwell, came out a couple of years ago, and they mapped around the world all the deltas. That was like pretty neat. They found those anchoring points right here where the river splits, the 2 points that anchor, along the coast where allegedly this part right here and this part right here are not deltaic floodplains or geomorphic area anymore. And then you have the river mouth and another anchorage point like close to it. And they did that for 2,174 deltas around the world. So now you roughly have the areas of each one of those deltas, right? And that's what you see on that white shaded area here. Am I doing good on time still?
10 minutes.
All right, perfect. And then on the bottom here, where you can see that range palette here going from what is this, like yellow to not purple, but kind of like reddish color, whatever. That the more yellow you are, the more likely you are a wetland, right? So that's the second paper right here in the bottom that classify the world's tidal wetlands using Landsat imagery, the probability of a roughly 30 by 30 meter pixel being a wetland or not, right? So you can pick your threshold. If you want to use just the 95th percentile of tiles to say that's a wetland, you're welcome to do that. If you want to do 50, you're welcome to do that. Here, we put them all, and you can see how this tremendous effort here to measure the world's deltas geomorphic areas, when you overlap with those deltas, you know, it does a pretty good job. Everything's almost like inside of it. But when you talk about, and especially when you talk about coastal, brackish, saline, marshes, and mangroves, a lot of it gets left out, right? And we were trying to work with those data sets. So here's the Sutterbuns, right? This is the inactive part of the delta. This is the active part of the delta. So that's being relatively disconnected from the direct discharge of the river, still under the influence, but that's where you have your mangroves growing right here. And that's mostly, you know, fresh and brackish vegetation. But look at the amount of mangroves that get left out here. So when you try to use your reference values and uncertainties to come up with estimates, regional, global scale, you're off by a whole bunch because we haven't really made that line like, you know, for each one of those polygons to wrap around nicely and feed. So I think that's talking to Yap again this morning. I think different groups are trying to get to that. We're working with Doug Edmonds in Indiana and Tom Worthington up in Cambridge to try to do that now. And I think his Yap's groups is trying to do that as well. So that's going to be really important. And not only, I want to use that slide to also like bright up. We usually talk about mangroves and marshes or, you know, tidal freshwater, forested wetlands or emergent marshes. It's having those polygons for the deltaic geomorphic areas. It's going to be really important because those systems, they swap each other, right? So you have your saline marshes or mangroves encroaching into coastal forests that are freshwater. And there's like trade-offs in your carbon budget. You're getting the saline marsh going into a tidal freshwater forest. You're shutting off some of the methanogenesis, but you're losing a lot of the biomass that's stored in the tall trees that's going to decompose over time. So when you do, and Pat McGonigal and Matt Curl published a paper, I should have it here, sorry about that, but they published a paper a couple of years ago showing that balance at regional scale and global scale when you know, shut off a methanogenesis here, but you lose biomass from the woody vegetation, you end up with a very low, it's still a net sink, but it's much lower than if you just look at how much carbon you're sequestering or how much methanogenesis you are like shutting off with that encroachment. So a couple summary, yeah, and having those polygons like fit it nicely where they should go will allow us to work with different vegetation times as they change over time, right? So a few wrap up points here. Deltas are global mangrove hotspots, as you saw, supporting high productivity and carbon sequestration rates, right? I think, Mark, you went around the world, you saw that the tallest mangroves in the world, they're usually on deltaic or macrotidal systems, right? Yet deltaic mangrove settings are way undersampled, as you saw in the data, especially on the carbon fluxes part, relative to other coast environmental settings. So we've sampled a lot of estuaries and lagoons, but we know very little about what's going on our deltas for mangroves. We seem to be good in terms of carbon stocks, but still have a long way to do on the carbon fluxes side of things. The Coastal Carbon Library and Atlas, it's a good way to mitigate some of that bias. And improving the mapping of delta's geomorphic area should be a priority. So again, we can work with all kinds of tidal influenced vegetation formations, right? From mangroves, saline marshes, brackish, freshwater to tidal freshwater forested wetlands and so on, as sea level rises and change the landscape under our noses. That's all I had for today. Thank you.